Eddie Crow, well into his 70s, was short but sturdy, with a posture that hinted at the discipline of long-gone years. His hands, etched with a web of wrinkles, rested on the table, cradling a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. On his left temple, just above his eye, was a tattoo, a crudely inked eagle with outstretched wings, faded to a bluish-gray hue. It looked out of place on his weathered face, like a scar telling a story no one bothered to ask about. Eddie rarely spoke of himself, and when he did, it was brief, with a quiet smile that seemed to say, "It doesn't matter." But in his eyes, deep and dark as an autumn sky, lay the weight of decades. That morning, Eddie had walked into the diner, as he always did, at 7 sharp. He ordered his usual, scrambled eggs with 2 slices of toast and black coffee. The waitress, a young woman named Clara, gave him a warm smile but quickly turned her attention to other tables. Eddie didn't mind. He was used to being invisible, a shadow slipping through the hum of a world that had long stopped noticing men like him. But this morning was different. At a nearby table sat a group of 4 men, all around 40, dressed in work jackets and ball caps. They were talking loudly, laughing over some story about fishing, when one of them, a broad-shouldered man with a beard, suddenly fell silent and nodded toward Eddie. "Look at that old guy," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "What's with that tattoo? Looks like he lost a bet in some dive bar back in the 70s. The others laughed, their voices cutting through the air like a dull knife. Eddie didn't look up from his cup, but his fingers tightened ever so slightly on the ceramic handle. He heard it all, the laughter, the jab, the faint edge of contempt they didn't even try to hide. The tattoo above his eye wasn't a choice. It was a brand, carved into his skin during captivity, in jungles where the smell of gunpowder and fear was thicker than the air. Back in 1971, he'd pulled 24 brothers in arms out from under fire, but he himself was captured. The tattoo was their souvenir, a mockery of his courage. To Eddie, though, it was a mark of survival, a sign he'd endured more than those men could ever imagine. He took a sip of cold coffee, trying to block out their laughter, but the sound burrowed into him, like fine rain, soaking through clothes to the bone. Eddie wasn't one to respond to slights. He simply sat, his shoulders slumping just a fraction, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the window, where the flag swayed in the breeze. Then, the diner's door swung open and a man entered, one Willow Springs rarely saw. General James T. Wilson, retired, stood tall and lean despite his 65 years, carrying an aura that made people around him instinctively straighten their posture. His silver hair was neatly combed and his civilian clothes fit, as if he'd just stepped out of a command post. Wilson came to town once a year to visit his brother's grave at the local cemetery, always stopping at Marge's for coffee. But this time, his eyes, sharp as a hawk's, landed on Eddie. He noticed the laughter. He saw the 4 men exchanging mocking glances, nodding toward the old veteran. And he noticed the tattoo. To Wilson, who'd seen war closer than most would ever want, it wasn't just a tattoo. It was a story. He approached Eddie's table slowly, holding his coffee, and stopped across from him. "Mind if I sit, Sergeant?" His voice was low but clear, laced with a respect that made Eddie look up. Eddie blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't been called sergeant in decades. But something in Wilson's gaze, in his calm certainty, made Eddie nod. The general sat, setting his cup on the table, and leaned in slightly. "I've seen a tattoo like that before," Wilson said quietly. "Vietnam, right? Captivity?" Eddie froze. His fingers tightened around his mug, but he didn't look away. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice hoarse but steady. "Saigon, 1971. 24 men. I got them out. But me, they held on to me." Wilson nodded, his eyes never leaving Eddie's face. 24. That's not just a number, Sergeant. That's a feat." Eddie shrugged, his lips twitching into a faint smile. "Just did what I had to do." But Wilson wasn't letting it go. He leaned back, his gaze hardening. "You know they're laughing over there?" He nodded toward the men, who had quieted, sensing the tension at the nearby table. "They don't know what it means, but I do. And I'm not going to let them disrespect you." Eddie shook his head. "It's not worth it, sir. They just don't know." "That's exactly why I'm here," Wilson said sharply. He stood, his movements slow but deliberate. Then, in full view of the diner, he turned to Eddie and gave him a crisp, respectful salute. "For your service, Sergeant Crow, and for your sacrifice." The diner fell silent. Spoons stopped clinking. Clara froze with a coffee pot in hand. The four men at the nearby table exchanged uneasy glances, their smirks gone. Eddie, his eyes glistening, stood slowly and returned the salute. His hand trembled, but his posture was as straight as the young Marine he'd once been. Wilson wasn't done. He turned to the table of men, his voice cold and sharp as a bayonet. "You four," he began, his words slicing through the silence. "You think that man's tattoo is a joke? You know what he's been through? 24 brothers are alive because of him. And you dare to laugh because you can't imagine what real courage looks like." The men froze. The bearded one, who'd started the jeering, looked down, his face reddening. "We didn't know, sir," he muttered. "We were just—" "You didn't know because you didn't ask," Wilson cut him off. "Next time you want to laugh, think about who you're hurting. That man is a hero, and you're just sitting here, laughing." He turned back to Eddie, his expression softening. "Sergeant, let me buy you breakfast, and, if you'll allow me, I'd like to hear your story." Eddie blinked, his throat tight. "No story, sir. Just did my job." "Then let me tell it," Wilson said. That day, something shifted in Marge's diner. Clara, who'd overheard the exchange, set a fresh cup of coffee in front of Eddie without a word, but her eyes shone with respect. The four men quietly gathered their things and left, their breakfasts unfinished. And Eddie, who'd been just Mr. Eddie for years, felt a warmth in his chest he hadn't known since he came home, in 1973. Wilson sat across from him and began to ask, not prying, but with a quiet respect that made Eddie remember. He spoke of the jungles, of the night he dragged wounded brothers through the mud, of bullets whistling overhead while he prayed for enough strength. He told of captivity, of the tattoo his captors etched as a taunt, but which he wore as a mark of victory over death. And he spoke of the letter, yellowed, folded in his jacket pocket, written by a captain whose life he'd bought with his own freedom. Wilson listened without interrupting. When Eddie pulled out the letter and placed it on the table, the general unfolded it carefully. There, in faded ink, it read, "To Sergeant Edward Crow, for exceptional bravery and sacrifice. You are an honor to the Marine Corps." The signature belonged to a captain who died a year after writing it. "This isn't just a letter," Wilson said. "This is a legacy." Eddie shrugged, but his eyes shone. "Just did what I had to do." That day, Eddie's story began to spread through Willow Springs. Clara told her friends. Marge, the diner's owner, hung a copy of the letter in a frame above the register, next to the flag she raised every day. And General Wilson, when he returned to town the following year, brought with him an idea, a memorial plaque for Eddie and the other veterans whose stories had gone unnoticed. But for Eddie, the moment that mattered most was when he stood from his seat, feeling the eyes of the diner on him. He didn't want fame. He didn't want apologies. But when Clara held the door for him and the old flag fluttered in the breeze, he felt something he hadn't in years, dignity. This story is just the beginning. In every town, there's an Eddie, a quiet hero whose story waits to be noticed. So next time you see someone who seems invisible, pause, ask, listen. Because small acts of respect can change everything. Discover more inspiring stories at Hoffman's Stories. Subscribe to Uncover the Heroes Among Us. The autumn sun hung low over Willow Springs, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement outside Marge's diner. The air carried the crisp bite of October, laced with the faint sweetness of fallen leaves and the distant hum of a lawnmower. Inside the diner, the rhythm of life continued. Plates clinked, coffee brewed, and the jukebox in the corner played a soft rendition of Sweet Caroline that felt like a warm blanket over the room. The flag outside still fluttered, its frayed edges catching the breeze, a quiet reminder of stories untold. At his usual corner booth, Eddie Crow sat, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug, the faint outline of his eagle tattoo barely visible in the dim light. It had been a week since General Wilson's visit, since the moment that had shifted something in the air of Willow Springs. The diner felt different now, not louder or busier, but heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed Eddie's story and refused to let it go. The framed letter above the cash register, its faded ink glowing under the fluorescent lights, had become a silent sentinel, drawing curious glances from regulars and strangers alike. Marge, with her graying bun and sharp eyes, had taken to polishing the frame daily, as if it were a sacred relic. Eddie, though, remained the same, quiet, unassuming, his worn jacket draped over the booth, his eyes fixed on the world outside. But the town was changing. Word of Eddie's past had spread like ripples on a pond, carried by Clara's whispers to her friends, by Marge's proud retellings, by the hushed conversations of those who'd been in the diner that day. The four men who had laughed at Eddie hadn't returned, but their absence wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the way people looked at him now, not with pity, but with something closer to reverence. Strangers nodded to him on the street. Kids who once ignored the old man shuffling past now waved. And Clara, barely 20, had started slipping extra slices of pie onto his plate, her shy smile saying more than words ever could. Eddie felt the shift, though he'd never admit it. He wasn't one for attention. He'd spent decades burying his past, letting it sink into the silence of his days. But now, that silence was breaking. And it wasn't just the diner. The town council, spurred by General Wilson's parting words, had begun discussing a memorial. Not just for Eddie, but for all the veterans whose stories had faded into the background of Willow Springs. It was a small idea still in its infancy, but it carried weight. Eddie didn't know how to feel about it. Part of him wanted to disappear, to slip back into the shadows where he'd been comfortable for so long. But another part, the part that still stood tall when he saluted the flag each morning, felt something stirring, a quiet pride he hadn't allowed himself in years. That morning, as Eddie sipped his coffee, the diner's door swung open with a jingle. A woman entered, her presence commanding despite her simple attire, a navy blazer, gray slacks, and a scarf tied loosely around her neck. She was in her 50s, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, a journalist from a regional paper who'd caught wind of Eddie's story through a friend of Clara's. She carried a notebook, its edges worn from years of use, and a camera slung over her shoulder. She scanned the diner, her gaze landing on Eddie almost immediately. "Mr. Crow?" she asked, approaching his booth with a smile that was both warm and professional. "I'm Eleanor Hayes, with the County Herald. May I join you?" Eddie's shoulders tensed, his fingers tightening around his mug. He wasn't used to strangers knowing his name, let alone seeking him out. But her tone was gentle, not pushy, and something in her eyes reminded him of the nurses who'd cared for him after his release from captivity. He nodded, gesturing to the seat across from him. Eleanor slid into the booth, setting her notebook on the table. "I heard about what happened here last week," she said, her voice low enough to keep their conversation private. "About you and General Wilson and everything. I'd like to write about it if you're willing. Not just for the paper, but for you. For what you did." Eddie's jaw tightened. He looked down at his coffee, the steam curling upward like ghosts of old memories. "Ain't much to tell," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I did my job, that's all." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes softening. "Mr. Crow, I've been writing about veterans for 20 years. I've heard that line before. But what you did, saving 24 men, surviving what you survived, that's not just a job. It's a legacy. And I think people need to hear it." Eddie shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the weight of her words. He wasn't a hero, not in his own mind. Heroes were the ones who didn't come back, the ones whose names were etched on stones in cemeteries. He was just a man who'd kept going, one foot in front of the other, through jungles and nightmares and decades of silence. But Eleanor's gaze held no judgment, only patience. And that made him pause. "Why now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why does it matter now?" "Because," Eleanor said, "there are people in this town, in this country, who've forgotten what sacrifice looks like. They see an old man with a tattoo and laugh, because they don't know. But if they hear your story, they might start to understand, and you deserve that." Eddie didn't respond right away. He looked out the window where the flag swayed gently, its stars catching the morning light. He thought of the letter in his pocket, the one he'd carried for 50 years. He thought of the men he'd saved, their faces blurred by time but never forgotten. And he thought of the laughter from last week, the sting of it still lingering like a bruise. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady, "but I ain't doing it for me. Do it for them, the ones who didn't make it back." Eleanor smiled, a quiet triumph in her eyes. "Deal." Over the next hour, Eddie told her his story, piece by piece, like unearthing relics from a buried life. He spoke of the jungles of Vietnam, the heat so thick it felt like breathing mud. He described the night of the ambush, the chaos of gunfire and screams, the way he dragged his wounded brothers through the muck one by one, until his hands bled and his lungs burned. He told her about the months in captivity, the hunger, the darkness, and the eagle tattoo they'd forced on him as a mark of shame. But he also told her how he'd turned it into something else, a badge of survival, a reminder that he'd walked out of that hell and carried on. Eleanor listened, her pen moving swiftly across her notebook, but her eyes never left Eddie's face. She asked questions gently, probing without pushing, and when he faltered, she waited. By the time he finished, the diner had filled with the lunch crowd, but their corner felt like a world apart. Clara brought them fresh coffee, her movements quiet as if she sensed the weight of the moment. When Eddie reached into his jacket and pulled out the letter, Eleanor's breath caught. She took it carefully, as if it were made of glass, and read the words aloud, her voice soft but clear. "To Sergeant Edward Crow, for exceptional bravery and sacrifice. You are an honor to the Marine Corps." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "This is incredible, Mr. Crow. May I include it in the story?" Eddie nodded, his throat tight. "Do what you need to do." The article appeared in the County Herald 3 days later, front page, with a black and white photo of Eddie sitting in his booth, the letter spread out before him. The headline read, "The Quiet Hero of Willow Springs." It told his story, not just the heroics, but the aftermath, the years of silence, the way he'd carried his pain without complaint. It spoke of General Wilson's salute, of the laughter that had sparked a reckoning, of a town waking up to the man in their midst. Eleanor had woven it all together with a warmth that avoided sentimentality, letting Eddie's actions speak for themselves. The impact was immediate. By noon, Marge's diner was packed, not just with regulars, but with people from neighboring towns who'd read the article and come to pay their respects. They didn't crowd Eddie, didn't overwhelm him with questions. Instead, they left small tokens, a handshake, a nod, a murmured, "Thank you for your service." One man, a veteran himself, left a Marine Corps pin on Eddie's table, saying nothing before walking away. Clara started a jar for donations, labeled simply, "For the Memorial," and by the end of the day, it was overflowing with bills and coins. Eddie, true to form, tried to deflect the attention. He thanked people quietly, his voice gruff, and kept his eyes on his coffee. But there was a change in him, a subtle straightening of his shoulders, a lightness in his step as he left the diner each evening. He didn't talk about it, but Clara noticed the way he lingered a little longer, the way his fingers traced the edge of the letter before slipping it back into his pocket. A month later, the town council voted unanimously to dedicate a memorial plaque in the town square, not just to Eddie, but to all veterans of Willow Springs. General Wilson returned for the ceremony, standing beside Eddie as the mayor unveiled the bronze plaque, engraved with names and dates that spanned decades. The crowd was small but reverent, their breath visible in the chilly November air. The flag above them snapped in the wind, and for a moment, Eddie felt the weight of every name on that plaque, every story he'd carried with him. Wilson leaned close, his voice low. "This is because of you, Sergeant. You reminded them what honor looks like." Eddie shook his head, his eyes fixed on the plaque. "It ain't about me, sir. It's about them." But as the crowd applauded, as Clara wiped tears from her cheeks, as Marge hung a second copy of the letter in the diner, Eddie felt something shift inside him. It wasn't pride, not exactly. It was the sense that he'd finally come home, not to Willow Springs, but to himself. The memorial became a touchstone for the town. People left flowers at its base, veterans gathered there to share stories, and kids learned the names of those who'd served. Eddie still came to Marge's every morning, still ordered his eggs and coffee, still sat in his corner booth. But he wasn't invisible anymore. And in the quiet moments, when the diner was empty and the flag outside caught the light, he'd touch the letter in his pocket and smile. This is the power of noticing the unnoticed, of honoring the silent. In every town, there's an Eddie Crow, a hero whose story waits to be heard. So pause, look, listen. A small act of kindness, a nod, a door held open, a simple thank you can change everything. Discover more stories of quiet heroism at Grateful Stories. Subscribe to celebrate the unsung heroes among us.